Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the George Washington Presidential Library. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those that are new, my name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the director of the library here, and I'm thrilled to welcome everybody to tonight's talk. I think we're in for a real treat. David's a great friend of mine. He's a scholar that the field admires, and I think this is a really important book that is not just for the field, but I think for all of us. And we're going to have a great conversation. But before that, I have some housekeeping to take care of. Just want to talk about some events that we have coming up at the library that might be of interest. The first is on February the 13th. Is that right, Stephen? We're having a lunch at the library here. It's on a great topic. There was a portrait of George Washington that sat in the ambassador's residence in Paris for years. And everybody thought it looked like a Charles Willson Peale, but they couldn't figure out who actually painted it. And art historians use new technology, new research methods, and were able to confirm that it was a Charles Willson Peale of George Washington. And the art historians who did it, one of them, Carol Soltis, is going to come on the 13th for a lunchtime talk about how they made this discovery. So I invite you all there. I think we still have a few seats available. This is a lunch where you can pay for your lunch, and we'll provide a box lunch for you. So that's on the 13th. And then on March 7th, we have our first Michelle Smith lecture. And this book coming out is called Revolutionary Friendships, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the American Republic. And so I think this is maybe the first book that has looked at George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as friends. I have to say there's a little bit of a rivalry that lingers between the two institutions today, but it's nice to put them together as friends as well. And this is by Frank Cogliano, who's currently the director of the library at Monticello and is also a professor at University in Edinburgh, Scotland. Also, just some other things. On the 12th, we're doing a brown bag lunch with a British landscape expert who's in residence here, looking at George Washington's estate through his expertise as a landscape historian and landscape artist himself. And I think it's going to be a fascinating walk through the plantation, through his eyes, what he's been observing here as both a practitioner and a historian. That's March the 12th. And then our next Ford evening book talk is March 28th. And that's featuring our own local George Mason University professor, Sydney Kerner, and her new book, The Tory's Wife. And she's also been a fellow here. So remember, February 13th, a lunch, March the 7th, another talk here, and then March the 12th, another lunch, and then March 28th, another talk here. So I hope to see you all at these events. And so now on to the reason we're all here, and that's to listen to David Waldstreicher talk about his new book, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, A Poet's Journey Through American Slavery and Independence. And David is somebody who I've known for a long time, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of his work. He is currently the Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. His other books are Slavery's Constitution from Revolution to Ratification, Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution. And the first book I ever read of David's, which is as a graduate student, so that's how I met him, but is required reading for everybody, In the Midst of Perpetual Fetes, The Making of American Nationalism, 1776 to 1820. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including being an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society, fellowships from the Doris and Lewis Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, the American Philosophical Society, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. He's also taught at Temple University, the University of Notre Dame, Yale, and Bennington College. David, you want to join me? So David asked, we always give our guests an option to either give a lecture or give a conversation. And David immediately said conversation, which I'm really grateful for, because that means that I have to read the book really intensely. And this was a great book. In fact, I emailed a colleague of ours, a very senior, established, distinguished scholar. In fact, I won't name them, but they're a George Washington Book Prize winner. And I said I read this book, and they responded they had read it too, and they provided a whole new window on Phyllis Wheatley and her work as a poet. So it is a fantastic book, and I'm excited to talk about it a little bit more, but I encourage everybody to buy it, to read it like I did afterwards. So I want to begin with what seems like a very simple question, but who was Phyllis Wheatley?
Oh, if I do, I might not stop if I get started.
Yeah. Give us
Phyllis Wheatley.
Give us the bullet points of
Okay.
what, if you were to look up her greatest accomplishments, what would people say? And then we can delve into who she really was.
Phyllis Wheatley was the most famous African in the English-speaking world of the 18th century. She came to Boston on a slave ship, the Phyllis, in 1761. She was about 7 or 8 years old. Within a couple of years, she was writing poems, and the Wheatleys noticed that she was very talented and precocious, and provided her some kind of an education. We don't know exactly whether she went to school or whether it was the Susanna and her daughter Mary, probably, who taught her. But by the time she's 14, they are placing her poems in newspapers, and they're circulating in Boston, and they're getting attention. And she really became famous when she wrote a poem on the death of Reverend George Whitefield. And that poem was republished in London, as well as appearing in newspapers and as a broadside. And even there's even an edition that with a sermon on the death of Whitefield by Ebenezer Pemberton that appeared as a pamphlet. So she's becoming, by the early 1770s, she's becoming very well known. And they start, the family and others start to talk about gathering her poems for a separate book. And in 1773, they end up publishing it in London. She goes over to London to oversee that and to go on a kind of book tour where she met many famous people and was feted, and that book tour through one of four possible scenarios that I lay out in the chapter on her emancipation led to her being free. But I guess the thing that by this point in her life and career as a writer that's really important to know is that she was writing in several genres of poetry, that some of her poetry was quite political, and beginning to be critical of slavery, as well as engaging with public events like the death of the great evangelist George Whitefield, but also things like the repeal of the Stamp Act and the ascension of Lord Dartmouth, return of Lord Dartmouth to office as Undersecretary of State for the Colonies, and things of that sort. So she's very ambitious, very precocious, even still as a teenager, and really is becoming a transatlantic celebrity, and is starting to be used as evidence by some leading intellectuals and folks who are critical of slavery, as more and more people started to be during these years, as an example of why it is that slavery for Africans was not something to be taken for granted, was something that was really artificial and should not be, was really any sense that Africans could not do what she was doing was about their condition and not about their origins or racial characteristics. So to shorthand it, she's really a one-woman anti-slavery argument already by 1772-73, and she's making the argument in her own way, and others are also making it for her. So these events lead to her becoming emancipated, and I found what I think are other poems that in the newspapers that she published pseudonymously. She had published had published a few poems without her name being attached to them earlier. But then the Revolutionary War happens, and that kind of scrambles some of the plans, though it does also lead to Susanna Wheatley passes away. The Wheatley family kind of disperses. The twins both get married. She's a refugee during the war. Goes to Providence with Mary Wheatley and her husband, Reverend John Lathrop. Gets married right after John Wheatley passes, but she doesn't inherit anything from the family. She marries one of the most impressive, interesting African youngish men in Boston, someone who had been was in a business partnership, and it was said represented himself at others at court. And they seem to do well for a while, for a little bit, and then they struggle economically, and we know very little. It's very hard to find out much about the last 6 years of her life. She seems to have, but she's still writing. She publishes 2 poems celebrating the American victory in the war in 1783 and early 1784, and but she dies along with, according to one member of the Wheatley family later on, along with her infant child or children in 1784, at a time when John Peters, her husband, was in debtor's prison. And those are the basic outlines of her life. There isn't a lot of documentation on it, so I tried to figure out as much as I could based on the footprints that she left, and figuring out how people are reacting to her and why. And it's a book that took a long time to write, and only really one scholar had tried to write a full scholarly biography of her before. And so there's some speculation in the book, and there's some there's a lot of interpretation, but a lot of what's the thing, I guess, one other thing I'd say, because I haven't said it yet, it's often one of the things I first say about Wheatley, but is especially important to say here at Mount Vernon, is that one of the things that's remarkable about Wheatley is not only that she became famous and her poems were reprinted and people knew about her, and her book made her even more famous, is that part of what made her famous was that she interacted. She had these consequential interactions with leading people in Boston, like who she wrote poems about or who promoted her, ministers, Thomas Hutchinson, Lieutenant Governor, folks like that, but also with people who we think of as some of the most important and powerful people, who were not just literary or religious figures, but also political figures. I'm thinking particularly of Lord Dartmouth, Benjamin Franklin, when she's in England, who goes to see her and writes a letter about that. Thomas Jefferson, posthumously, because he writes about her in Notes on the State of Virginia, actually trying to say, oh, she's not that big a deal, and well, I'm sure we'll get back to that. And perhaps most interestingly of all, George Washington, who she writes a poem about, and in late 1776, and accompanied with a letter, and he then writes back to her, and then asks Joseph Reed to try to place the poem in a newspaper or magazine, which he does, both in the Virginia Gazette and the Pennsylvania Magazine, Tom Paine's new magazine in Philadelphia. So I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity to talk about that interchange, which is most of one of the chapters in the book.
That would not escape my attention.
I thought so. Yeah.
No, that's a great overview. And I kind of want to just dive into some of the walk through her life, some of the things that I was struck reading this book, and maybe you could just kind of expound upon each one of these moments or a poem. And I have to say that your reading of the poems were, really insightful. They were engaging too, and that's what our colleague also commented on. Is and I'm interested to talk about how you, as a historian, also adopted a literary approach to biography. But first, Phyllis Wheatley's first memory. Do you want to talk about that? Because I found that very fascinating. It's her remembering. She left Africa maybe when she was 8. Is that about right? But it's a memory that she had from there. And what do you make of it? That's my.
Wheatley didn't write about her experience in Africa of the slave trade or on the ship, the Phyllis, that she was named after. She didn't write about it directly. But in a memoir written as a preface to a republication of her poems in the 1830s, one of a grandniece of the Wheatleys recorded some things she'd heard in the family. And one of those stories was that the only memory that she had of her family, now I suspect it's not the only memory, it's probably the only memory that the white Wheatleys heard about, was of her mother pouring out water at the sunrise. And so what does that mean? It's probably a ritual, what we would think of as a religious ritual. And I think the language that's used is pouring out water to the sun in the sky. Right? So one of the things that's and associating with her mother. Now, it has been noted before that this is something that makes a lot of sense in various African cultural contexts, and is a very positive image, and shows that Wheatley had a felt connection to the family that she left when she was very young, and I think all that's true. I also find it interesting because Phyllis Wheatley, in addition to being a religious and evangelical poet, was also a neoclassical poet and has many references to Greek and Roman poetry and to the 18th century English writers who were publishing translations of those poets and who were riffing on them. In, for example, Homer, in the Odyssey and the Iliad, there are many scenes of people, especially women, pouring out water as a ritual of thanks to the gods. So I think it's very interesting that Wheatley would choose to not only remember but also tell that story. It's a link not just from Africa to her present and to the Wheatley family or others who she's telling the story to, but it's also a link that shows how maybe learning about those Greek and Roman worlds and that Greek and Roman poetry that's represented by Homer, maybe that was a way for her to talk about a world, a Mediterranean world, a kind of ancient world, a world that her contemporaries in British North America may see as primitive, but also value culturally. It's a way for her to talk about this world in which there is slavery, there are voyages, people are kidnapped and sold, there are wars like the wars that were tearing apart West Africa in the time that she grew up, and in the Atlantic world also that she knew. So I argue that scenes like this and stories like this should be our clue into the poetry and help us perhaps read how doing this neoclassical thing was a way for her to talk about her experience as a woman and a trafficked person without talking about it directly. Because there is no way that the white people who were supporting her wanted to hear about her African experience. But they did want to hear that Greek and Roman culture was maybe just as universal and something that they could connect with and make comparisons with as the other ancient world and ancient texts that they're also doing that which is the Bible, the Hebrew, and the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So we think of these things as separate. In the 18th century, educated people do not think of the classical literature. They do think of it as pagan, but they don't think of it as completely different than the religious literature. They're interested in how they overlap and are different and making comparisons. And that's what I think Wheatley is doing, and is able to talk about some things that we wouldn't think she's able to talk about indirectly.
Now, her first lines, if I remember correctly, or if I understand correctly, they were kind of recently discovered at the Mass Historical Society. They were
in an almanac.
Yeah, yeah. Did you want to just tell the story of what we think were her first lines and what they tell us, if anything, about her?
Yeah, this was a fabulous discovery by Vin Coretta about 15 years ago now. Jeremy Belknap, who was one of her fans in Boston, minister, historian, important literary figure, pretty young at that time in the 1770s, scribbled in an almanac, as people then did scribble in their almanacs, right? At some point after the fact, Phyllis Wheatley's first effort, and it's kind of like a little ballad. I argue that this is really a. Should I talk about the poem itself? Yeah. Okay.
What do people want? Do we hear about the poem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to find it. It's been almost a year now, so I
was impressed.
I don't know.
You thought you knew exactly what page it was. That was.
I was afraid I forgot my Washington riff. I had to reread that chapter. I realized it had been a little while. So okay,
that question's still coming.
Okay. Mrs. Thatcher's son is gone unto salvation, her daughter too. So I conclude they are both gone to be renewed. So he wrote it out. He wrote it out twice because he was trying to figure out, okay, what's the meter here? Where the end stops, right? Like somebody wrote it out like it was a sentence, right? Or told it to him, and he writes it down. But I kind of wrote it out differently because I feel like this is just like an Isaac Watts ballad, like that you would hear in church. These ballads that were for worship, but also people read and enjoyed at home, especially Baptists and Methodists. And and like a lot of her earliest poems, it's about people in the neighborhood, and it's about life and death. And so it turns out the Thatchers live like down the block, and she's saying that it's tragic that they're gone, but I conclude that they are probably saved. When she does that, she's both saying, I have a relationship to these people who are neighbors and are close to my family, but she's also doing something that people who wrote elegies in New England culture did, which is you basically are taking the role of the minister. You're saying who's saved and reassuring the family that they've probably gone to a better place, right? So it's a very humble, like childlike thing, like a nursery, like what we would think of as a nursery rhyme, right? Those rhymes that some of us grew up with come out of that tradition. But it's also audacious, especially coming from an enslaved person.
And she's probably 12.
And she's right. He wrote it down in 1773, but since we know when Mrs. Thatcher's son died, it was in 1765. We know that she's 11 or 12, years old. Right. So this is the first poem we know about, and that Belknap assumed was her first effort. It's probably not.
Yeah, that was great. So I want to talk about her as her political writing, especially in the lead up to the Revolution, and just what her position was, how she viewed the empire, what her status it was within this empire as she was being, an outspoken figure. And I know a couple of the poems that came to my mind were America, I think, which was 68. And then one that is it Commodore Hood or, this was kind of foreign to me until I read your thing. So if you want to tell us the story of Commodore Hood as well.
Okay. So what's one of the things that's, the Boston context is so important. She's right there where the protests are starting. She writes about the repeal of the Stamp Act, and I think she's reading the newspapers. I think she knows exactly what's going on. And the way she writes about some of the most important events and patriot figures really tracks what we might call the center of the protest movement. The first one, the Stamp Act poem, is to the king, and it's a thank you poem. It's like, thank you, King George, you get it. Unlike Parliament, maybe, but you've restored our liberties, and it's very like.
This is after the repeal.
This is after the repeal, and she even says, and in one version of it, she even says, "A monarch's smile can set his subjects free." Right, like the monarch is the great patriarch and almost godlike in his ability to restore liberty. So this is the patriots going over the head of Parliament, even though it wasn't King George really who repealed the Stamp Act, but this is a way to participate without being that challenging or oppositional. It's not saying Parliament can't tax us. None of that. She's not getting into any of that. But she is performing. She's saying, I understand British liberties. I understand what's going on here. Two years later, when she writes this poem that wasn't published, the America poem, it's much more challenging. It's a story about how New England becomes this refuge for liberty, and then Britannia, who's figured as a woman, starts to abuse her and not understand that she's growing up and needs to be independent. It's a mini epic that probably she intended to add to, and it's actually pretty audacious. And it also is one of the places where you see her writing things that can be read as referring to slavery, to black slavery, to the slavery of Africans as well, even as she is using the patriot rhetoric and developing the patriot rhetoric of the British are enslaving the Americans. And as she's doing this, and as Boston is being occupied by the king's troops, by large numbers of them, and she's right there seeing that happen, she writes this poem to Commodore Hood, who has just pardoned a deserter. And what she's actually done, and this is the first of a series of poems that she writes to officers, first British officers, and then later Continental ones, like Washington and General Lee, and I think there's one I think she wrote to Gage later on, where like the good British officers, they get it, and she's building relationships with these people because she doesn't know which way it's going to go. She's like many in Boston. She really is kind of like sort of hoping that the good British people who will understand and who will preserve American liberties, even though there's something not quite right about the occupation and the things that are happening. And so then she the Hood poem is quite interesting in that regard, because she chooses this figure who was actually really well liked, who was one of the commanding at that time the commanding naval officer, and who seemed more sympathetic than, say, General Montague, who was clearly anti-American and anti-patriot. So even with these really deferential and celebratory poems, what she gets is that poets write these poems that celebrate important figures and talk about their virtues, and especially ministers, but they also have a particularly important relationship to military figures. And this is something that she may have learned or understood even in West Africa, because the role of the poet was to celebrate these warriors and kings and leaders, and as it had been in Greek and Roman times. So she's inhabiting this role, and while she's doing things that are political, and so maybe at some moment she seems like, which side is she on? Is she going to go with the Tories or is she going to go with the Whigs? And she's hedging her bets, and she's being really subtle and careful. But while she's doing that, she's making a career for herself. Everyone is seeing that she can inhabit this exalted role of the poet, while it might seem like, well, female poets, maybe they can do this religious thing, and maybe it's male poets who do these political and military things, she's doing all of it. It's really, really ambitious what she's doing, and what she's getting away with already by 1767, 68, at a time when, and so that's why I think her publication strategies are also very careful. Sometimes folks presume that the best poems were published. Actually, sometimes the most interesting poems were the ones that were passed around, and she didn't publish because she knew that they wouldn't appeal to everybody. They would only appeal to certain audiences.
Well, actually, I have two questions that really come to mind right now. The first is all these poems that were in manuscript, how they survived and where are they? And the second one, which is totally unrelated, if you were to make a movie of Phyllis Wheatley in this period of the 1760s, 1770s, as Americans are, becoming more and more radical, more and more outspoken, the streets are filling with people, the taverns are filled with arguments, the newspapers are flooded with all of this increasingly radical rhetoric and literature. What was Phyllis Wheatley doing day to day? Where was she herself? And I know there's no record of it, but you've so immersed yourself in her. What do you think she was doing in this period?
Okay, I'll answer that one first, and you'll remind me of the other question. It's from the evidence we have, it's pretty clear that she was an important member of the household and doing work. There's sometimes been this presumption that the Wheatleys were so enamored of the experiment in education and evangelism that Phyllis represented, that they basically let her read and write all the time. I don't think that was the case at all. I think that she was bought to be a household servant at a time when Susanna Wheatley is getting older. Her daughter is becoming a teenager and marriageable, and she is doing work in the household. I think that she's just so brilliant, and maybe it's entirely possible. And there's some reference to her, the descendant of the Wheatleys, suggested, and I think imagines that, said, oh well, they let her stop what she dusted, and she this that, and whenever she was inspired, they let her like put down the mop and take up the pen. I think that's just the stereotype that goes back to New Englanders who in the 19th century became abolitionists and wanted to say that slavery was never important. But if you read the newspapers in that time and you look at the ads for enslaved people for sale and the fugitive ads and all the other evidence we have, enslaved people are doing all kinds of work and they're highly skilled. And the other thing to realize about New England at this time is that everyone has to be in a household. If you're an orphan, you are assigned to a household and you work. Like, yes, it was a highly literate society. People were taught to read so that they could read the Bible, and there's more schooling going on than there is anywhere else in North America, in Boston. But nevertheless, there's that young people are expected to work, and their work is really, in a cash-poor economy, the work that servants and and kids do, enslaved, indentured servants, apprentices, and just children do, is extremely important. So we need to take that, like, penny saved is a penny earned, Benjamin Franklin, of Boston ethos that we think of with New England, and we need to put that back into the way that slavery worked. That people, that they didn't have to have plantations or be producing for the market for the labor of kids and slaves to be quite valuable, because that meant one more thing you don't have to pay a wage for or spend money on. So I do think that during the day, she's cooking, she's cleaning, she's helping out, and I think that helps explain why she has this very close relationship with the family members, yet they also keep her at a distance, because that, like, they can think that they can, when they want to, they think of her as a slave, but when they don't want to, they think of her as a family member. It's both at the same time, and that is not unusual. And I try to interpret that in a way that I think helps explain some of the things that happen, and this paradox that she says that Susanna Wheatley treated her like a mother, like a daughter, yet she clearly wants to be free and get out of that situation. So it's not the kind of thing I think that her poetry both performs her close relationship to the Wheatleys and to that household, but also shows that she is thinking ahead and thinking about what her life what she wants her life to be like when she becomes an adult. And so both those things can be true at the same time.
Actually, that's a great segue to a big part of your book is about the Somerset Case. And I don't know if you want to share briefly what the Somerset Case is, but more importantly, how it relates to Phyllis Wheatley and her story.
Right. Briefly, and this is hard for me to do because Patrick, thanks to Patrick, we had a scholars conference at the American Philosophical Society on the Somerset Case and its meanings and reverberations. And I'm editing a book of essays on it now that is all about how complicated it is. So it's hard for me to shorthand, but I'll try. The Somerset Case was a really important moment in the development of anti-slavery and abolitionism in England and America. James Somerset was enslaved to a British customs officer, one of those guys who was enforcing the rules in Boston, Charles Stuart. He'd been enslaved to Stuart for 20 years, and Stuart takes him over to London because basically things have gotten too hot in Boston, and Stuart wants to go back home. He's got estate stuff to deal with, and so he goes to London, and while he's in London, in late 1771, Somerset runs away. And months later, Stuart and his agents recapture Somerset, put him in irons, but some of the anti-slavery people, including Granville Sharp, get a writ of habeas corpus for him, and that says that he can't sell him and put him on a ship for Jamaica, as Stuart intended to do. And so then it becomes a court case about whether he can be transported. And so it's a test case, basically, for whether, it's not whether slavery is legal, it's whether someone can be kidnapped and put on a ship and sold outside of England. So it's a habeas corpus issue. It's an issue about the liberties of people in England, whether they are enslaved or not. And Lord Chief Justice Mansfield of the Court of King's Bench tries to get the parties to settle. The case drags on for months. He doesn't really want to issue this decision that might have implications for the law of slavery. But at the end of the day, largely because the West Indians who are bankrolling paying the lawyers want to get this precedent that says that they can take their slaves back to England and then take them back home, they won't let go of it. So Mansfield says, you know what? There may be these laws in the colonies that say that you can take your slave wherever you want to. That may be the way things go in Boston and Virginia and Jamaica, but not here in England. English air is too free, so that we don't have that kind of slavery here, where this slavery that you take for granted in America, Parliament's never made a law about this. See, I can't shorthand it. It's important. So this becomes, so immediately it gets cited, and as you can imagine, the anti-slavery people are saying, look, slavery, they start over-interpreting it, and so it becomes this anti-slavery precedent, and legal scholars have been arguing ever since. What did Mansfield say in the courtroom? He didn't issue a written opinion. What did this really mean? This doctrine of free soil or free air. So it's been controversial ever since. But it was very encouraging for Granville Sharp and the abolitionists, and really it's been dated as the beginning of the end of slavery in England, because a lot of masters in England, where there are 15 or 20,000 enslaved Africans, they start to realize that they may not be able, that it's going to be hard for them to recapture folks, and so it is really decisive in the end of slavery in England. So Wheatley is over there in London shortly after that. The case has been reported in newspapers, especially in Boston, where there's a whole debate about it that goes on for months. So Vin Coretta, in his biography, argued that it's because of the Somerset case that when Wheatley goes to England, she realizes that she doesn't have to go home, and then she's able to negotiate, saying, I'm not coming home. And also Susanna Wheatley is dying, and so she says later that she left because Susanna Wheatley asked for her, needed her. And in fact, she doesn't, she lives for about, I can't remember how many months, 7 or 8 months longer. So she goes back, but it's clear that something has been worked out, where maybe because the Wheatleys were embarrassed, because in London, one of the newspapers, one of the reviews of the book said, can you believe those hypocritical Americans? They're talking about their liberties and how we're enslaving them, but they're holding this genius in slavery. So there's an embarrassment factor also going on. But Vin, in his book, argued, I think, I don't really agree with this, that it's because of the Somerset case. I think that Wheatley had this idea that I think that things are heating up, and I think it's more about the embarrassment, or more about something they had decided earlier on, that after the book was maybe supposed to fund her emancipation, because she also says that whatever money came out of the book was going to be hers, which is not something an enslaved person can do. An enslaved person cannot own property. So there are a lot of factors going on here. I don't think the Somerset case freed her in that way. I think that actually that's actually too narrow a view. It's of what's going on of both the complications of the politics around the Somerset case and the different ways that Wheatley was sort of mixed up in this question of what exactly slavery was, at a time when it's being criticized and when the law is not clear. And I think most importantly for me, and this is where my interpretation may be distinctive, at a time when really the debate is about, and I think Wheatley knows this very well, it just isn't clear what kind of slavery they had in Massachusetts. What would it mean in the future? Something that Phyllis Wheatley knows is that societies all over the world may have slaves. There's slavery in Africa. The Greeks and the Romans had slavery. Massachusetts has slavery, Jamaica has slavery, but that doesn't mean it works the same way everywhere. It's not hereditary everywhere. It's not race-based everywhere. So Phyllis Wheatley knows that really talented slaves who earn it one way or another get emancipated. That's the more normal thing. This, like, slavery is hereditary and you pass it on to your children and it's only for people who have a certain skin color from Africa. That's weird. That's only this, like, West Indian and mainland thing. And it's not clear that that's the way history is going to go. And that's where she's pressing it, and that's where is the issue that's really coming up in the Somerset case. And looking back on it, we presume that slavery was just one thing in the Americas or in the 18th century, and it wasn't. And that's what Phyllis Wheatley is dealing with, though she's dealing with it in a context where people are starting to talk about slavery as if it's just the opposite of liberty in this more general way, and that is having an effect too, as I suggested. Okay, I knew I couldn't do it short.
The Somerset decision is something that you know I have talked about and we've studied, and it's such an important event in the history of, I think, the British Empire. But yet Americans, it's not part of our story of the Revolution, and yet it does intersect with that story as well. And I think Phyllis Wheatley in your book shows how that happens. So I only have time for maybe two more questions before opening it up, and I can't avoid not asking you about George, which there is a great story during the Revolution, which she writes a poem to the general, or His Excellency, I think is the title. And also
Generalissimo.
Oh,
right. Okay. In the letter, now that you're Generalissimo of the armies, like, she wants him to be what he actually isn't, which is, like, in charge of everything. Right.
So she writes him a letter as well. And the interesting story is when Washington reads the letter and then rediscovers it. And you really show in this story the importance of Phyllis Wheatley, but also a lot about Washington, who he is and how he thinks, and his awareness of the situation and also himself. So you want to tell us that story?
So you bought it, my interpretation.
I'm just reiterating what you said.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm looking for an argument because I haven't really gotten to talk about this with Washington experts yet. I guess it must not be too outrageous because nobody's written me any angry emails. But so we have letters from Washington. This letter from Washington where he writes to Joseph Reed, and when he gets around to publicizing it, he says, I got the letter. The letter was written, had been written weeks and weeks before. He basically says, I just happened to rediscover this on my desk just now. It got buried. Like you have this, you have this image. He paints this image of his messy desk, right? Like that he was cleaning up and he happened to come across it. Well, what has happened between when she sends the letter
with the poem too, right?
With the poem, which praises him to the skies, and his rediscovery of it, writing to Reed, and then writing to her, thanking her, and inviting her to come visit him at headquarters in Cambridge.
And to tell Reed to publish it.
And to tell Reed to publish it. Well, when he gets it, there's this major issue about whether they are going to accept enslaved or free black people in the Continental Service in Massachusetts and Connecticut, where the war is. This is November, December 1776. So the Continental Congress in Massachusetts, they've kind of decided no for slaves, which is what they're most worried about, in October. But they've already got slaves and free Africans who have served already at Bunker's Hill, and there are a couple hundred of them probably who have already served. And they're getting this idea that they're not welcome, and they're kind of pissed off. And everybody knows this. And if they're pissed off, are they going to go over to the other side? I mean, these are people who know. They know the landscape. They may know our battle plans. They hear rumors. Meanwhile, and then November, you've got Lord Dunmore starts recruiting Africans in Virginia. And Washington is writing very concerned letters about that, and the Continental Congress is talking about it, right? So, and things aren't going that well, right? So there's a lot of talk about it. Washington decides in December very clearly that they will accept that this is Massachusetts. Dunmore is about recruiting slaves from masters quite explicitly, but you know what? We don't have to do that. We can just say that we will accept people who come willingly. We can accept people who are freed by their masters in order to serve. We can accept people Africans who are already free. We basically already have in New England what Dunmore is trying to engineer, which is that, okay, like we'll free slaves, but only if they serve, right? We've already got that. So that becomes the compromise solution. And it's then, so basically, at a time when it looks like the British officialdom is trying to recruit, and also proposals have been explicitly made in Parliament that the way to win this war is to recruit slaves and arm slaves. Former governor of South Carolina and Jamaica, Littleton, has said this on the floor of Parliament, and he's not the first person to say it. So this is there's a diplomatic game going on about what side are the black people going to be on. And basically, Wheatley is a diplomat in that process. In writing the poem to Washington, she's basically saying, enlist me, maybe even enlist us. We, at least in the North, will be on this side. And Washington is dealing with that very cautiously. And then he says, okay, let's try to contain this, but also try to keep the Africans on our side at least as much as we can, where we are now in New England. And so then it's accepting Wheatley into his publicity machine and doing the thing that poets do, which is praise the generals, praise and say, our side is on God's side. And so so this letter that Washington writes has been interpreted by some Washington biographers like Henry Wienseck, and I think less cautiously Ron Chernow, as, oh, look, Washington is becoming so enlightened by all this talk about slavery, and he's realizing it's all wrong, and he's becoming anti-slavery. And even Jim Basker, in his very fine essay in Women in George Washington's World, the book that came out of a conference that I think was done here, there's this desire to see this, okay, Washington's on the road to knowing slavery is wrong and becoming anti-slavery, as we know he's going to be in his will. I think that's less important than Washington is a really smart political and diplomatic player, as we know he was. He's very concerned, as he says explicitly in the letter to Reed, very concerned about publicity and image, his own, because he's already got, there are other generals who would like to take over, and there are already people saying he's not doing the job, his strategy is all wrong, et cetera, right? And still, military historians still arguing about whether he was a dummy whether he wasn't that good a strategist, or whether he was learning and becoming a great one, or whether he was always a great military genius. I'm not taking a position on that. But what I do see here is that is what I think everyone has known for a long time. He's quite politically savvy, and that extends to the politics of race and slavery in wartime. And everybody knows what we don't know, which is that war enslaves. Wars lead to the enslavement of people in the early modern world and in the ancient world. But wars also liberate slaves because they can get their freedom by fighting. They're needed. And he knows that. Everybody knows that. It's common sense. So he knows that this is going to be an issue, and he's dealing with it. So what I see in this interchange is two very, very smart people thinking about the big picture and doing their jobs. And, Washington knows about poets. And a couple months later, David Humphreys sends him a poem, and next thing you know, David Humphreys is on Washington's staff. He's another one of these. He's another Hamilton. He's another one of these young geniuses who he's going to cultivate, and who's going to be part of his publicity arm. And that's kind of what Wheatley actually was, for at least for a moment there.
That's great. I think it's time to open it up for
I'm sorry,
questions from the audience.
I haven't gotten a chance to tell that story
No,
to an audience that is as interested in
'cause
Washington.
you knew it was
as
going to
this
be
one is.
here.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Steven's passing the mic. We do want to use the mic because we have a live audience remote right now.
Hi, Melchior Baltazar. Fascinating book, and I haven't read it cover to cover yet, but I think you're trying to put yourself into her mindset as she is kind of going through these different events is fascinating. So I have actually two questions. One is, do you have documentary evidence of when she was manumitted, and when she was that made public to her circle and to a wider audience that she was actually freed?
What we have is her saying different things about it to different people in a couple of letters. And this was actually the last part of the book I wrote, because my editor said to me, I don't understand this. How was she freed? And I realized I was dodging it because I don't know. It's not clear. She says different things about when it happened and how it happened to different people. It's clear around when it happened, after she after she says that she had papers drawn up, and her friend, and in one letter she says her friends in England insisted on it, and that that Israel Maudet, who was one of the colonial agents in London, who was a lawyer, assisted her in one of the letters. And in that letter, she makes it sound like the Wheatleys were against it. But then in another letter, she says that the Wheatleys were kind enough to manumit her, and so that it may have happened before. So what I lay out these four possible scenarios of how it happened, and then I argue at the end of the chapter that this is another example of her being very, very cagey and careful. Nobody wants to hear her bragging about how she managed to get herself free. That's not going to do her any good. People do want to hear about how grateful she is, or just that it has happened and that so she's going to be okay. So she basically covers her tracks. Even in telling some people about what happened, she covers her tracks. So she wanted us not to know. She wanted people not to know. I'm sure there were some people who knew exactly what happened, but the evidence we have which is in her testimony, but suggests that there's this process where it's another example of her always knowing who her audience was.
Fascinating.
And it tells us something about how difficult it was to become free at this time, even though a lot of people are starting to think that maybe slavery was not going to last that long, or that some people should and ought to and were becoming free, that you had to be very, very careful and very, very smart and crafty and lucky in order to manipulate those situations.
Thank you. Second question. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet, he sneered. Why was Jefferson so critical of Phyllis Wheatley?
That is a great question. And in many ways, that was my way into this. One of my ways into this this project. And the key thing, let me just starting with Jefferson. He writes that in Notes on the State of Virginia. And he's doing two things in Notes on the State of Virginia. He's writing for an international audience, saying how great Virginia is and how it's going to recover nicely after the Revolutionary War if it gets support from French and British people. But he simultaneously writes very critically about slavery and the effects of slavery on white Virginians, but also and says that slavery is unjust and invokes God's possible judgment on Virginians, but he says that because of the history, we can't live with these people, and if they're freed, they have to go somewhere else, maybe back to Africa or somewhere. And he says, he speculates that Africans are not equal. So he actually makes, and this is this is very hard thing for us to accept, because we think that racial arguments about inferiority always went with pro-slavery. Actually, his racial argument is actually enabling him to criticize slavery in a way that isn't as radical or threatening and won't get him in trouble, he hopes, in Virginia. But I think it's really important that he doesn't actually intend for Virginians to, this isn't aimed at his fellow Virginians, it's aimed at a French audience who want to believe that America is enlightened and doing something about this problem of slavery. So where does Wheatley come in? He's answering, if he's going to make this argument that black people are different and shouldn't be considered as possible future citizens, and make it in this scientific way as he does, he's got to deal with the fact that people had used poets like Francis Williams and writers like Ignatius Sancho and Wheatley herself as evidence that black people who were educated were equal. So he has to trash Wheatley. And he does it in her case by saying she's not a good poet, and she's merely a religious poet, when that's not what she was at all. And so what I imagine is that he had a copy of Wheatley's poems in his library that's in the Library of Congress. What I think he'd been trotting out this diss of Wheatley. I think he tried it out at cocktail parties. It's such a devastating one line. I think he tried it out and he got some chuckles with it, and so he threw it in there. But I think that she's actually his kryptonite. I think that she's a real threat. I think that he actually knows that if people know who Phyllis Wheatley was and what she did, all the arguments he's making about how to think about race and slavery don't work. So he waits till after she's dead, which is when he's writing this he's writing this between 1783-84 and publishes it in 1787. And when she can't answer back, and then he puts it out there that forget her. Yeah, that's what I think. That's how I'm thinking about it. That actually it's not just him being prejudiced. It's actually a sign that he gets it, but he can't accept it. So he's being political and polemical. Jefferson loved poetry. He loved Homer. He gets it. But what he says actually is, he says, Wheatley in her book says Terence, the Roman playwright who was a slave, she cites him in her first poem as an example, that she's not the only one, right? Look, there are black people in Rome, and some of them were poets, and some of them were celebrated. He says, actually, we all know that Terence was really white. Why does he go out of his way to say that? It's probably because some people were saying the opposite.
Question over here?
I have two questions. One is about yourself, how you became interested in writing about Phyllis Wheatley. And then also, do you have information on her impression on George Washington influencing his changing attitude about slavery? Yeah.
I'll answer that first. No. But Jim Basker, in his essay, speculates, and he does something really interesting that I hadn't thought of. Washington in his will makes this point when the slaves of his that he freed, he makes this point of saying that they should be taught to read, that they need to be taught to read and write. And then he even says that it's really important to me that this part of my will be followed up on. So what Jim says is maybe the emphasis on reading and writing is influenced by his encounter with Wheatley. I think I hadn't thought about that. I think that's really interesting. That shows the collective process of scholarship. Like, I brought a lot of other contexts to this project, but I've written about Washington before. I'm fascinated by Washington, but I hadn't reread Wiensek. I didn't think about the will. I didn't think about this, and like, I don't know that I wouldn't have put it in the book because that's something that happens later, right? And I don't. But it's interesting, and it's worth thinking about and talking about. I came to this project for a whole bunch of reasons. One is that Wheatley. I wrote a little bit about Wheatley in my first book about the celebrations because she wrote celebratory poems that were part of these nationalist celebrations that I was talking about, and that sometimes became places to talk about slavery. So I had a paragraph on her poem "Liberty and Peace," which celebrated her poem celebrating military victories and the end of the war. And then in my book on Franklin, I talked about her interaction with Franklin, and which I felt had been misinterpreted. Similarly, it had been used to say, "Oh, look, Franklin's becoming anti-slavery. He's so enlightened." Actually, when Franklin writes about that interchange, he says, "I went to see the poet, but I like, her master was angry that I was there, and so I couldn't do anything for her, and so much for that." I think he's actually keeping his distance because people are using Wheatley and the slavery issue against the Americans, and he's actually also doing a diplomatic thing, keeping his distance. So I had a different interpretation of that. So between those two things, I was teaching courses. I always taught Wheatley when I taught the Revolution, but the bigger thing really, which gets back to why it is that the book is so literary, even though I'm a historian, is that I was an English major as well as a history major in college. I was an aspiring college poet at one time, and I got my PhD in American Studies, where we didn't make that distinction between history over here and literature over there. And I ended up, and even though in my first teaching posts I taught American Studies, I ended up teaching mostly history later in my career in the last 15 years or so. And I guess this was a way of getting back to literary stuff, but also while continuing to write about slavery and the Revolution. And so it appealed to me both as a kind of a challenge that I could afford to do, as something that was difficult to do at a certain stage in my career, but also a way for me to come back to literary topics and to show that this kind of thing can be done fruitfully.
Well, In the Midst of Perpetual Fets is actually, I think, very similar in terms of the way you're reading, poetry, but other works of literature in that. So I actually saw some of that earlier work here too. It's interesting to say that. Do you have other questions there? And then do you have one? Yep. Okay.
This may be too tangential in terms of some of what you've thought about here, sir. And by the way, I've enjoyed thoroughly everything that I've heard this evening, so I thank you. Henry Louis Gates seems to have taken a perspective between Washington and Jefferson, that Jefferson really believed that the whole slavery thing was due to kind of an inferior race piece. Now, like I said, that may be too tangential from the book, but I am kind of wondering what your thoughts might be on that. But I also am wondering about John Peters. You mentioned him just very briefly, and I kind of have my own intuition of who he was and what he was about and kind of what happened to him. But I'm wondering what more of your thoughts might be on that.
I think Jefferson I think Jefferson's being political in that he doesn't really believe it when he's all that stuff about race. I think that we need to see we need to see race and slavery as having a politics, and all these guys as politicians, and sometimes they make arguments that they don't fully believe at particular times to particular audiences for particular reasons. And so I think we have a tendency to look for, but when we talk about slavery and race, we have a tendency to look for belief or prejudice or the lack thereof. And I think that we need to get beyond that and realize that especially when we're dealing with the political figures, we are that's too limiting an approach. I'm not sure it always matters because because the effects of what I mean, Gates is right to say that this had huge effects, what Jefferson wrote. But I'll just say that it's important to realize that Notes on the State of Virginia were actually controversial in the early Republic. Some people used the anti-slavery parts of it. Say, look, President Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong. And even some Southerners, as they pro-slavery folks, started to criticize Jefferson and say, this just shows how off the wall and speculative and philosophical he was, right? But other folks, some pro-slavery folks, didn't pay attention to that part and started to use the racial stuff to make racial pro-slavery arguments. The other question, Peters, right? I think he's really accomplished and interesting, and that she married him because he was one of the most impressive black guys in town, and I think she made a real statement by doing that. Most of the testimony about him, and you know what? Everything that was ever said about him that we know is very complimentary, that he was really impressive, except the stuff that comes from the Wheatley family. Basically, they acted like in-laws who thought that he wasn't good enough.
Oh, what about they stole her from them?
Yeah, he took her away, and maybe he didn't like them. Maybe they condescended to him, right? I couldn't say this directly because I don't have evidence of it, but I think it's not that surprising. They were still saying negative stuff. They lost touch with her, and I think later on they felt most of the members of the family are dead by 1790. Everyone who lived in that house with her died, but there are these nieces and nephews, and they're wondering, what's the after story here? And she died young, and they blamed it on him. They basically said, she married the wrong guy, and it didn't work out, and we appreciated her, but her husband didn't, and they wrote this story that for a long time was the story about John Peters, but. Cornelia Hughes Dayton has done this great research and found John Peters in court records and filled in some of his biography that shows that he had reasons to he was a property owner. He was gonna first he's a merchant and then he's gonna own this farm, and that really they had big expectations. But a lot of people in Boston and in Massachusetts, this is the early 1780s. There's still a war going on, and the economy is in bad shape. So, and they become victims of that. And John Peters ends up in debtor's prison, like a lot of other people. So that's my interpretation of Peters. That and what happens to her. And I think it's really important that we not see it as a unique tragedy. That, of course, it's tragic that her children don't survive and that she died young. But you know what? Poets didn't get to have careers in the late 18th century. And a lot of former emancipated people had a lot of trouble. A lot of poor people had a lot of trouble in Massachusetts at this time. It's only that she became that famous that we think she should have, or that it's unexpected or strange that things didn't work out for her. So I like to keep the focus on just how much she did and just how much she has inspired so many people ever since. And that's why that I try to tell that story in the last chapter of the book on her afterlives. I think that's more important than actually the end of her actual life story, because she was a celebrity, because she was a political person, and because she was a writer. And writers want to live after through their work, not through the details of their biography.
I like to think that her spirit is very alive in Amanda Gorman.
Well, I see it's about 8:15, and I think you still have books to sign. So I think if we could all give David a round of applause. Thank you, David. And these books are available for sale, and you're willing to stay for a
Sure.
little bit longer to
Sure.
sign it and take. I know there are other questions, and you'll be able to take questions afterwards too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thank you all. Yeah. Sorry.